In the harsh frontier lands of Red Flint, the wealthiest man in the valley rejected all the powerful women vying for his heart. But it was a poor seamstress, living in a forgotten shop, who made him stop. Not with beauty, not with wealth, just with a patched coat mended on a cold night, and the fact that she didn't need him. The story of Coulter Vance and Marin Holloway will show you that the most precious things in life are never put up for sale. Like and comment with the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has come. The winter that nearly broke Red Flint came without warning, the way the worst things usually do. It started as a gray afternoon in late November, the sky pulling low over the valley like a wool blanket being dragged across a dirt floor. By the time most of the town's residents had shuttered their windows and stoked their fires, the storm had already made up its mind. Wind came screaming down from the high ridges to the north, carrying ice that wasn't quite rain and wasn't quite snow. Something in between, something mean, the kind of precipitation that found the gaps between collar and skin and settled there. Streets that had been dusty and rutted an hour before turned to dark, slick mud. Signs that had hung steady for years swung and cracked. Somewhere on the far end of Mercantile Row, a shutter tore loose and went skidding into the dark. Most people were inside by then. Most people had the good sense to be. Coulter Vance did not particularly care about good sense when he had business to finish. He came down off the ridge trail at 5:30 in the evening, his big roan gelding picking its way through the iced-over ruts with the careful irritation of an animal that knew better than to complain out loud. Coulter sat straight in the saddle the way he always did, not because it looked dignified. He didn't think much about how things looked, but because a man who slouched on a horse generally made worse decisions than a man who sat upright. His father had told him that once, half drunk and mostly right, and it had stuck. The town materialized out of the frozen murk piece by piece. The livery, the feed and grain, the hotel with its crooked porch lamp guttering in the wind. Red Flint was not a beautiful town and had never pretended to be. It had grown up around the cattle trade the way most frontier towns did. Practical, fast, and a little ugly. And it wore that history in every warped plank and every mud-packed alley. Coulter had ridden into it for the first time 12 years ago with $43 and a letter of introduction that nobody had honored. And he had built everything he owned from that unpromising start. He knew every building in Red Flint. He knew which men owned them and which men merely thought they did. He tied the roan at the rail outside Dunmore's Provisions and went in to settle a supply account that had been sitting overdue for 6 weeks. Harold Dunmore was behind the counter, red-faced and apologetic in the way of a man who owed someone money and knew it. "Mr. Vance, didn't expect to see you out in this weather." "Weather doesn't know my schedule," Coulter said. "Let's look at the ledger." They spent 40 minutes going through numbers that didn't quite add up the way either of them wanted. Dunmore had shorted 2 shipments of dried goods to the Vance ranch over the summer, claiming the supplier had sent underweight sacks, and the credit he was offering didn't match the arithmetic Coulter had already done in his head during the ride down. They settled somewhere in the middle, which meant neither of them was entirely satisfied, which Coulter privately considered the most honest outcome you could reach with Harold Dunmore. He was pulling on his coat to leave when the first real disaster of the evening announced itself. The seam went with a sound that was almost embarrassing, a long tearing rip that started somewhere at the left shoulder and traveled down the back panel of his coat like a verdict being read aloud. The coat was old. He knew it was old. He had bought it off the trapper outside of Cheyenne 8 winters ago for $3 and a bottle of rye, and it had served him well for most of that time, but the leather had dried and cracked through 3 brutal seasons, and the stitching on the back seam had been threatening mutiny for at least 2 years. He had simply declined to negotiate with it. The cold came in immediately. He could feel it on his back through the flannel of his shirt, sharp and decisive. Harold Dunmore looked at the coat with the careful neutrality of a man trying not to enjoy someone else's misfortune too visibly. "That's a bad tear." "I can see what it is," Coulter said. He stood there for a moment, turning options over. He had a spare coat at the ranch, but the ranch was 11 miles out, and the ride back in this weather with a split coat would be genuinely unpleasant. He could buy something off the rack at Dunmore's, but Harold stocked work coats designed for men half Coulter's size, built for farmhands rather than for someone who intended to be on horseback in a blizzard. He could go to the hotel and wait out the storm, But he had cattle to check on in the morning, and he didn't trust overnight weather reports that started the way this one had. "Is there a tailor in town that's still open?" he asked. Harold scratched his jaw. "Most folks go to Elsa Pruitt over on 2nd Street, but she closes up by 4, and in this storm she's probably been home since 2. He paused. "There's the Holloway shop, but—" He stopped. "But what?" "Nothing. It's just, she's over at the end of Sutter Lane, the old Fenwick building. Hardly anybody goes there." Coulter waited. When Harold didn't continue, he pulled the ruins of his coat tighter across his shoulders and said, "Thank you, Harold," which meant the conversation was over. Sutter Lane was the kind of street that happened to towns rather than being planned by them. It had started as a gap between two buildings that someone had widened into a footpath and then into something wide enough for a single wagon, and it had never quite graduated beyond that. The buildings along it leaned toward each other in the way of old structures that had been subsiding for years, and most of them were either empty or occupied by enterprises that didn't require much foot traffic. A document copyist, a clock repairman who mostly fixed things people had given up on, a storage depot that smelled permanently of mildew. The Fenwick building was at the far end, set slightly apart from its neighbors, on a lot that had once held a more ambitious structure before a fire had taken it down to the foundation. Someone had rebuilt on that foundation, but they had built small and practical, 1 story, 2 front windows, a door that sat crooked in its frame. A sign hung above the door on a single remaining hook, the other hook long since gone. The sign read, "Holloway Needlework and alterations in letters that had been painted by someone competent but not recently." Light came through one of the front windows. Not much of it, the soft, warm yellow of a lamp rather than anything that advertised itself. But it was there. Coulter knocked, nothing for a moment, then the sound of something being set down, and footsteps crossing a floor, and then the door opened about 4 inches, stopped by a chain he could see glinting in the gap. The woman who looked out at him was somewhere in her early 30s, maybe a year or 2 either side of that. Brown hair that had been pinned up at some point in the day and was now doing its own thing. A canvas apron worn over a plain dress that was neither new nor ragged. She had a pair of small scissors hanging from a ribbon around her wrist, and she was looking at him with the particular expression of a person who has been interrupted in the middle of careful work and is waiting to find out if the interruption was worth it. "Shop's closed," she said. "Not rude, just informational." "The sign doesn't say hours," Coulter said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked past him at the dark street behind him, and at the storm making itself at home across every surface it could reach. "What do you need?" she asked. "My coat tore. Back seam, all the way down. I need to get back to my ranch tonight, and it's 11 miles out." A pause. She was evaluating something, him or the situation or both, and she was doing it straightforwardly, without the performance of deliberation that some people use to make you feel indebted for their eventual yes. She just looked at him, thought about it, and made a decision. The chain came off. The door opened. "Come in then," she said. "Let me see it." The shop was small and looked like a place that had been arranged by someone who cared more about function than appearance and had stopped apologizing for it. 2 work tables ran along the back wall, both of them occupied. One with a half-finished garment pinned to a cutting board, the other with what looked like a leather harness in pieces, the straps laid out in a pattern that suggested she'd been taking it apart rather than putting it together. Shelves lined the other walls from floor to ceiling, holding bolts of fabric, organized spools of thread, boxes whose labels were written in a small, precise hand, and tools she had clearly acquired over years rather than all at once. A single lamp hung above the primary work table, angled to throw its light exactly where it was needed and nowhere else. A small stove in the corner was doing its honest best against the cold, and largely succeeding. Coulter took off the coat, which required some careful maneuvering given the state of the back seam, and handed it across. She turned it in her hands without speaking. He watched her look at the tear, running a thumb along the split edge of the leather, then checking the rest of the seams with a quick but systematic attention that suggested she was doing several assessments at once. She turned it inside out. She looked at the lining, which had its own history of repairs, most of them rough. She held the tear up toward the lamp. "This is old work," she said. 8 years old, maybe 9. The leather's dried out. Whoever tanned it didn't finish it properly to begin with, or it's just lived a harder life than it was built for. She looked at him, not unkindly. I can close the tear. It'll hold, but you should know the leather around it is compromised. Another hard use and you'll get a new tear somewhere close to where this one is. How long? 2 hours. Maybe a little less if the thread takes clean. Coulter looked around the shop, then back at her. What's your rate? $1.50 for leather repair of this length. Fair enough. She was already moving toward the work table, clearing a space for the coat. There's a chair by the stove if you want to wait. I don't have coffee made, but there's water in the pitcher. He could have gone somewhere else to wait. The hotel was 2 blocks over and they had actual coffee. But he sat down in the chair by the stove. He told himself it was because it was cold outside and the stove was warm, which was true as far as it went. She worked without talking to him, which he appreciated. He had spent the last several months in a sustained campaign of people trying to talk to him, and the variety of their approaches had become exhausting in a way that was hard to explain without sounding ungrateful for attention he had never requested. The trouble with having money in a frontier town was that money was a story everyone wanted to be in. Coulter had accumulated his through cattle, through land, through 12 years of decisions, some of which had been good and some of which had been costly, and a few of which he still turned over in the dark hours of the night. And the accumulation had changed how people saw him in ways that were sometimes useful and more often tedious. He was, depending on who you asked, a visionary or a tyrant or a stroke of luck or a cautionary tale. What he mostly was, as far as he could determine, was a man who had learned to read cattle and weather and contracts better than most people around him, and who had been willing to work when working was unpleasant, which, in his experience, it usually was. The current campaign to win his interest had been going on since the previous spring, when Harlow Beckett's daughter Adelaide had announced at the Founders' Day supper that she intended to marry Coulter Vance before the year was out, and approximately 6 other women in the room had decided at more or less the same moment that they intended to do so first. Adelaide Beckett was 24, beautiful in the calculated way of a person who had been told they were beautiful since childhood and had built a personality around it, and she had no idea that Coulter found her exhausting within 4 minutes of any conversation. Then there was Patricia Yunt, whose father owned the second largest spread in the valley, and who had sent Coulter a written invitation to a private dinner that had been so elaborately phrased that his ranch manager, Ned, had read it 3 times before concluding it was, in fact, a dinner invitation and not a legal document. Coulter had sent a polite decline and a bottle of wine, which had apparently been considered an encouraging sign rather than a conclusion. There had been others. The Moreau widow from east of the ridge, whose cattle operation was genuinely impressive, and who Coulter might have been interested in getting to know as a business associate if she hadn't opened their first conversation by telling him she had picked out curtains. 3 daughters of the Cattlemen's Association members who had appeared at his ranch on separate occasions with food, which he had eaten because the food was good and he was a practical man, but which had not advanced their respective causes in the direction they intended. He was not opposed to women. He was not opposed to marriage in principle. He was opposed to the specific transaction that these particular efforts were proposing, which was essentially, I will provide you with status and appearance and social lubrication, and you will provide me with security and money and a place in this valley. He could see the logic of it. He had watched his parents conduct exactly this exchange over 30 years, with competence and without much joy, and he had reached the private conclusion that he would rather stay alone than replicate the arrangement. What he wanted, if he was honest with himself in the way he rarely was on this particular subject, was someone whose interest in him was not primarily about what he had built. Someone who would look at him and see a man rather than an inventory. Someone who was interesting in their own right, separate from him, with their own competence and their own direction. He had about concluded that this person did not exist in Red Flint and was making preliminary peace with that conclusion. Across the shop, Marin Holloway worked steadily on his coat. He watched her without being obvious about it, which was something he was reasonably good at. She had a way of working that was economic, not rushed, but with no wasted motion. Each thing she picked up was exactly what she needed next. The needle moved through the leather with the confidence of someone who had made this motion 10,000 times before and did not need to think about it consciously anymore, the way an experienced rider doesn't think about balance. She had some kind of wax that she ran the thread through at intervals, which he understood was to make it slide smoother and seal better against moisture. And she was using a two-needle technique that interlaced the stitches in a way he couldn't quite follow, but that clearly locked them against each other. "You're working on a harness," he said after a while. She glanced up without stopping the needle. "Taking one apart. The rigging design on it is wrong. The breast collar sits too high and the traces are too short for the angle of pull on a loaded wagon. Whoever made it built it for the look rather than the function." "Whose harness?" "Mine, now. I traded a coat repair for it. I'm going to rebuild it properly." He looked at the pieces spread out on the other table. "You design tack?" "I redesign it when what's available doesn't work." She said it without pride, just as a statement of how things stood. "Most of the gear sold in this valley is built for flat country. The terrain around here is different. More pitch and pull, more side loading on climbs. The standard rigging causes sores and inefficiency that people blame on the animals when it's the equipment that's wrong." Coulter was quiet for a moment. "I've lost 3 horses to shoulder sores in the last 2 years. The trail boss says it's the drives." "It might partly be the drives," she said, in the tone of someone being fair. "But if your equipment is loading wrong, the drives will make it worse faster." He looked at her. "Have you told anyone else this?" She gave him a look that was brief and dry and communicated several things at once, chief among them being that the question was slightly naive. "I've mentioned it. People who've been buying and using the same gear for 20 years don't generally welcome the opinion of a woman who mends coats for a living." She returned to the needle. "I expect they'll figure it out eventually." There was no bitterness in it, which was what caught him. He had heard a lot of bitterness in this town from people who had been dismissed or overlooked. He had felt some of it himself, in the early years, when the men with established operations had looked at him like a problem that would resolve itself through failure. Bitterness was understandable, but it also had a way of curling inward, of making a person small in the ways they didn't want to be small. This woman didn't have that quality. She sounded like someone who had simply filed the information away for her own use and moved on. "What else have you figured out?" he asked. She looked up again, and this time there was something in her expression that was harder to read. Not suspicion exactly, more like assessment, as though she was deciding whether he was asking to be polite or because he actually wanted to know. She must have decided something because she said, "The wool blankets most outfits use on long drives are the wrong weave for the climate out here. They absorb moisture and hold it. A tighter twill would shed better, dry faster, weigh less over distance." She paused. "The canvas on most chuck wagons is the wrong weight, too heavy for what it needs to do, and not waterproofed properly at the seams. A lighter canvas with proper seam sealing would keep contents drier and reduce load weight by maybe 30 pounds on a fully loaded rig." Coulter looked at her. "You've been working this out for your own interest or with someone in mind?" "My own interest," she said simply. "Nobody's asked." She finished the coat at 8:15. He could hear the storm still conducting its business outside. The wind had, if anything, picked up in the last hour, and at some point actual snow had joined the ice, and the shop had gotten colder despite the stove's efforts. She brought the coat across to him, turned it to show him the seam. The repair was clean in a way he hadn't expected. He had been anticipating something that would hold, which was all he'd asked for. But what she had done was something more than that. The stitching ran in even intervals that were tight enough to seal against weather, but not so tight they would pucker the leather. She had somehow feathered the tension at the ends of the tear, so the repair blended into the surrounding material rather than announcing itself as a patch. Where the leather on either side of the old tear had been rough and fraying, she had done something with what looked like a small, heated tool to lay the edge back down and set it. "That's better than it was before it tore," he said. "Probably." She said it matter-of-factly. "The stitch pattern will hold better than the original, and I used a wax double lock so it'll shed water. The leather is still dry, though. You'd want to condition it properly before next winter, or you'll be back." He put the coat on. It fit properly again, the shoulder sitting where it should, the back hanging straight. He reached for his wallet. $1.50, he said, already counting. "That's right." He handed her $2. She went to get change from a tin on the shelf, and he said, "Keep it." She paused. Then she turned around and looked at him with an expression that was not gratitude and not offense. It was more careful than either. I'd rather make change, mister. Vance, he said. Coulter Vance. Something moved across her face quickly, but she recovered. She made change and handed him 50 cents with the precision of someone making a point, and he took it because arguing would have been missing the point entirely. Thank you, he said. You do good work. That's what the $1.50 was for, she said. He stood there for a half-second longer than was strictly necessary, and then he nodded once and went to the door. Outside, the storm was full dark and full voice. He could see the roan still tied at Dunmore's from here, patient and miserable, head down against the wind. He had 11 miles of frozen road between him and the ranch, and a coat that was, for the first time in years, actually going to keep the cold out. He walked back toward the horse. Behind him, the lamp in the Holloway shop window stayed lit. What? The ride home was brutal, in the specific, anonymous way of winter weather that has no interest in you personally. The snow had laid down maybe 2 inches on the road, and the ice beneath it made the footing uncertain on the downhill stretches where the roan had to think carefully about every step. Coulter's hands got cold despite the gloves. The wind was in his face for most of the first 4 miles, until the road curved south and he got some shelter from the ridge. He had made this ride in worse conditions, and he made it now with his head down and his attention on the horse, checking her footing, reading the ground ahead in the dark the way long experience teaches you to do. He was thinking about the harness pieces laid out on the work table, not about Maren Holloway in the way that a lesser man might have immediately thought of her, with the sort of reductive attention that a woman working alone and late gets from men who interpret solitude as availability. He had no interest in being that kind of fool. He was thinking about the things she had said. The rigging design is wrong. The breast collar sits too high, and the traces are too short for the angle of pull. He was thinking about those 3 horses and the trail boss's explanation that had never quite satisfied him, and about the way she had said it, not to impress him, not to sell him anything, just because it was true and he had asked. He had a meeting in 2 days with Harlow Beckett and 2 other Valley ranchers about pooled equipment for the spring drive. He had been planning to discuss the standard arrangements. Now he was thinking about whether there was a different conversation to have. The ranch lights came up after an hour and 40 minutes, appearing one by one through the snow. The barn lamp first, then the bunkhouse, then the main house with its 2 front windows warm against the dark. Ned was still up, which meant he'd been watching for Coulter's return, and came out to take the roan before Coulter had finished dismounting. Storm was worse than they said, Ned offered, walking the horse toward the barn. Usually is, Coulter said. He went inside, stood in the front hall shrugging off the repaired coat, and hung it on its hook. Under the lamp, the seam ran clean and tight down the back panel, the stitching even as type on a page. He stood there for a moment, looking at it. Then he blew out the lamp and went to bed, already turning over in his mind a question he hadn't entirely formulated yet, about cost and efficiency and a woman in a forgotten shop at the end of Sutter Lane who had apparently been solving problems for the cattle industry in her spare time and telling nobody about it. He went back 4 days later with a saddle that needed the billets replaced. It was a deliberate choice. He had other saddles. He had a leather worker who came out to the ranch every few months to handle this kind of maintenance, and the billets were not so far gone that they couldn't wait. But he wanted to see if she did leather work beyond coats, and he wanted another conversation, and he chose the saddle because it was an honest reason rather than a manufactured one. She was open in the daytime, which surprised him slightly. The shop looked different with the front curtains pulled back, more put together than it had seemed in the storm dark, the window display actually containing a small selection of finished goods, a pair of gloves, a folded canvas jacket, a leather satchel with interesting stitching detail on the flap. Inside, she was working at the cutting table, a spread of brown canvas in front of her and paper pattern pieces pinned across it. She looked up when he came in, and there was a brief moment of recognition. Not warmth exactly, just the acknowledgement that she knew who he was now, which was different from the first night when she'd just seen a cold man with a torn coat. "Mr. Vance," she said, "what can I do for you?" He set the saddle on the counter. "Billets are cracking. I need them replaced and the tree checked. It's been sitting since September, and I think the weather got to the leather." She came around the table and looked at the saddle the way she'd looked at the coat, with that systematic attention that started at one end and moved through to the other. She ran a hand along the seat, checked the stirrup leathers, pressed her thumb against the billets to test the crack depth, then looked at the underside of the skirt. "The tree's fine," she said. "The billets are bad. You're right. And the skirt stitching on the left side is pulling away from the rigging." She turned the saddle slightly to show him. "If that goes, your rigging plate could work loose." "You see a lot of saddles?" "Some. People mostly bring me clothing. But I'd rather fix this right than have someone come back and tell me a man came off his horse because I missed a pulling seam." "How long?" "Day and a half. Maybe 2 days if I have to source the billet leather. I don't keep heavy skirting in stock." "What's your price?" She thought about it. $3 for billets and replacement, $1.50 for the skirt stitching, 50 cents to check the rest of the rigging while I have it apart. $5 even. "That's fair. I'll pay in advance if you want." She looked at him with that careful assessment again. "Half now, half on pickup is fine." He paid the half. She wrote him a receipt, which he noticed she did with a small, precise handwriting that matched the labels on the shelf boxes. He was about to leave and then didn't. "The harness you were rebuilding," he said. "Did you finish it?" She tilted her head slightly. "Most of it. I'm still working on the breast collar angle." "I'd be interested to see it when it's done," he said. "I have 40 working harnesses on the ranch, and if the geometry is wrong on them, I'd like to know." She looked at him for a moment. "That's a lot of harnesses." "It's a big operation." "I know what your operation is, Mr. Vance." She said it without sharpness. It was just a statement of fact. Red Flint was a small town, and the Vance Ranch was its most discussed topic. "I meant, that's a significant number to evaluate. I'd compensate you for your time." Another look. Still that careful quality, like she was reading something beneath the surface of the conversation and hadn't finished yet. "Let me finish the breast collar first," she said. "If it performs the way I think it will, I'll know the theory is right. Then we can talk about whether it's worth applying to 40 harnesses." "That's reasonable," he said. He took his receipt and left. Out on Sutter Lane, the cold was dry rather than storm wet, and the lane in the midday light was just a lane. The buildings leaning at their same angles, the clock shop, the document copyist, the end of it, where her sign hung on its one hook. He stood there for a moment thinking about nothing in particular, and then he went back to the main street where his horse was waiting. The 5th time he came in, not counting the 2 times he'd stopped to ask about the saddle's progress, which he had reasonably classified as practical rather than personal, she looked up from her work and said, "You could just knock instead of trying to decide whether to come in." He had been standing in the doorway for probably 10 seconds, which was about 9 more than he usually allowed himself to appear uncertain about anything. "I wasn't trying to decide," he said. "You were doing something out there for a while." He came in and let the door close. "I was thinking about something else and happened to be standing there." "All right," she said, and went back to what she was doing, which appeared to be some kind of pattern work on a long piece of canvas. She didn't ask what he was thinking about. He noticed that she rarely asked personal questions of the fishing variety, the kind of question that was really an invitation for him to start talking about himself. Most people who wanted something from him eventually got around to those questions. She didn't seem to want anything from him that she hadn't already named and priced. He sat down in the chair by the stove, which had become his habitual location in the shop over the previous 2 weeks. She had stopped commenting on it, which he took as acceptance rather than resignation. "The harness is working," she said, without looking up. "I put it on my neighbor's draft horse, and took it out for 2 hours of loaded pulls up on the grade behind Cutter's Mill. No shoulder pressure, the traces are tracking correctly. No slippage in the collar." "That's what you expected." "I expected it to work better than the old design. I didn't expect it to work as well as it did on the first real test." She said it with the slight reluctance of someone trying to be accurate rather than modest. "It needs more testing, but the geometry is right. I want to bring you one of mine to compare against," he said. "If you can tell me which harnesses are rigged wrong and how to correct them, the efficiency gain on a spring drive is real money." She nodded slowly. "Bring one that's been in use. Ideally one you can see sore patterns on the horses after a long pull." "I have one," he said. "Chestnut gelding named Bard. Gets a sore behind the left shoulder on anything over a half-day haul." Bring me the harness he uses, and I'll show you exactly what's happening. He would, and he did. And she was right. And the correction she prescribed, a small adjustment to the collar fit and a different placement of the trace attachment, solved the problem so cleanly that when Ned reported it 2 weeks later, he said it like he was mildly annoyed that nobody had figured it out before. But what Coulter was sitting by the stove thinking about that evening, while she worked at the canvas pattern and the stove made its small sounds and the street outside was quiet, was not the harness at all. He was thinking about the way she had said, "I didn't expect it to work as well as it did on the first real test." The slight surprise of someone who is rigorous about not overclaiming, who would rather underestimate her own results than defend an inflated expectation. He was thinking about how rare that quality was, in his experience, especially in people who had every reason to want credit, who had been working without recognition long enough that the recognition would have been genuinely justified. "You've been here 2 years?" he said. She looked up. "Closer to 3. What happened before Red Flint?" A pause. "That's a longer conversation than you came in for." "Maybe I came in for a longer conversation." She set down her work. She looked at him with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was not entirely open, the face of someone deciding how much to say about something she had thought about a great deal and said out loud rarely. "I had a shop in Grantley," she said. "Further east, smaller town. I built it from nothing over 4 years. Then the land speculator that owned the building I leased decided he wanted to resell the block to a development company. He had a lawyer put something in my renewal contract that voided my lease if the sale went through. I didn't have a lawyer reading my contracts. By the time I understood what had happened, I had 60 days and nowhere to go." "You fought it?" "I tried. I didn't have money for a real legal challenge, and the judge in Grantley played cards with the speculator's partner." She said this with a flatness that was not resignation. It was the flatness of someone who had finished being angry about something and arrived somewhere colder and more useful. "So I left. I found this building, which was cheap because nobody wanted it, and I started over." Coulter was quiet for a moment. "The speculator? He's still in Grantley?" She looked at him with an expression that was half warning and half something like amusement. "Yes. And I don't need you to do anything about him, Mr. Vance." "I wasn't offering to." "You were thinking about it." He probably had been, on some level below the level he was paying attention to. He decided to be honest about that. "Maybe, but you're right that it's not my business." "No," she said, "it's not." But there was no sting in it. She picked up her work again. "What happened in Grantley is over. What's here is what matters." He sat with that for a while. Outside, someone went by on the street, horses' hooves muffled on the packed earth. The stove ticked and settled. "I have a meeting next week with the Cattlemen's Association," he said finally, "about the spring drive supply contracts. I'd like you to come." She looked up sharply. "Not as anything other than someone who knows more about trail gear than anyone else I've talked to in 3 years, he said. "I want them to hear the canvas argument and the harness argument from someone who can explain the engineering of it. They won't want to hear it from me." "Probably not, but they'll hear it." She studied him. He could see her working through it, the calculation of what it would cost her against what it might be worth. The question of whether he was genuinely asking or doing something more complex that she'd have to sort out later. "What time?" she said. "Tuesday, 10 in the morning, the Cattlemen's Hall on Front Street." She nodded once, the way she did when something was settled. She went back to the canvas pattern. He stayed by the stove a while longer, not because he had more business and not because he was trying to extend something, just because the shop was warm and the work sounds were quiet, and this was, he had slowly come to understand, the most at ease he had felt in Red Flint in a long time. The Cattlemen's Hall on Front Street had been built to impress, which it did, mostly by being larger than anything else on the block and having a set of double doors that were heavier than they needed to be. Inside, the main room held a long oak table that seated 20, a fireplace at the far end that was always too hot in summer and never quite enough in winter, and walls hung with the kind of framed documents and mounted hardware that announced to anyone who entered that the men who gathered here had been making decisions about this valley for a long time and intended to keep doing so. Coulter arrived at 10 minutes to 10. Marin was already there, which surprised him and then didn't. She was the kind of person who arrived early to a thing she was uncertain about, to have the room sorted in her mind before others filled it. She was standing near the window when he came in, wearing a coat he hadn't seen before, plain dark wool that was clearly her best, and she had her hair pinned properly and a leather satchel over one shoulder that he suspected contained notes. She looked like herself, which was to say she looked like someone who had come to do something rather than to be seen doing it. "They know I'm coming?" she asked when he reached her. "I told Harlow Beckett I was bringing a gear consultant," he said. He didn't ask for a name. She absorbed this. "So no." "No." She looked at him with an expression that wasn't quite reproach and wasn't quite resignation. "That's going to make the first 10 minutes interesting." "Probably," he agreed. The other men came in over the next few minutes. Harlow Beckett, first, broad and red-faced and carrying the particular confidence of a man who expected to run every room he entered, which in his experience he usually did. Behind him came Dale Pruitt, who owned 3,000 acres east of the river, and who had the slow, watchful quality of someone who counted everything twice. Then Warren Osley, younger than the others, aggressive in the manner of a man still trying to establish that he belonged at the table. And finally Russ Tamblyn, 60-ish and leather-faced, who had been driving cattle longer than the others combined, and who was the one person in the room whose opinion Coulter actually respected. Beckett saw Marin and stopped. The stop was brief. A man of his experience recovered quickly, but it was visible. His eyes went from her to Coulter and back, and in that transit communicated several things that he had not yet put into words. He pulled out his chair at the head of the table with a deliberateness that said he was resetting his expectations for the morning. "Coulter," he said, by way of greeting. Then to Marin, with a particular brand of courtesy that was actually a form of dismissal. "Ma'am, is someone expecting you here?" "I am," Coulter said before she could answer. "Marin Holloway. She's been doing work for the ranch on trail equipment. I asked her to come speak to a couple of things before we get into the supply contracts." A silence settled over the room. Dale Pruitt pulled out his chair without expression, which might have meant anything. Warren Osley looked at his hands on the table. Russ Tamblyn looked at Marin with the unsentimental assessment of a man who had learned to evaluate unfamiliar things quickly and accurately, and then looked away and picked up the agenda paper that had been set at each seat. Beckett sat. "Of course," he said pleasantly, and it was the pleasantness of a man filing a complaint that he intended to retrieve later. She presented for 20 minutes. Coulter had not seen her do this before. In the shop she was quiet, concentrated, a person whose communication was mostly through what she made rather than what she said. But in front of the table she was different, not louder, not performing anything, just clear. She laid out the canvas argument first, because it was the most immediately translatable to money. The weight savings, the moisture retention problem, the cost comparison between standard canvas and the tighter weave she was recommending. And she had numbers that she had worked out on paper that she placed in the center of the table for anyone who wanted to check her arithmetic. Russ Tamblyn picked up the paper. He read it while she kept talking. He did not interrupt. The harness geometry argument was harder for the room because it required them to accept that something they had been doing for years was wrong, which was a more difficult thing to ask of men who had built their operations on the premise that their own judgment was reliable. She handled it without making it an accusation. She said, the standard rigging was designed for flatter country and a different load configuration. It performs correctly in the context it was designed for. In this valley's terrain, the angles are different, and the design doesn't compensate for that. It wasn't a condemnation of anyone's choices. It was an argument about geography and physics, and she made it that way. Warren Osley, halfway through, couldn't stop himself. You're saying every harness in this valley is rigged wrong. I'm saying the standard design creates unnecessary sore points on livestock operating in sustained grade terrain, she said. That's different from wrong. Wrong implies a mistake was made. This is just a mismatch between a general solution and a specific problem. Osley blinked. He had not expected precision. Beckett let her finish and then sat back in his chair with his hands folded. Miss Holloway, he said, this is interesting work. I'm curious where you developed these theories. The word theories was doing a particular kind of work in that sentence, and everyone in the room could hear it. Testing, she said evenly. I rebuilt a standard breast collar harness and ran it on a loaded draft horse over 2 hours of grade work on the ridge behind Cutter's Mill. I have observation notes if anyone wants to look at them. She reached into the satchel and produced a folded set of pages. The collar pressure points under the standard design were visible within the first 40 minutes. Under the rebuilt design, none appeared. "One horse," Beckett said. "Yes, one test. I said as much to Mr. Vance when I presented it to him." She looked at Beckett without flinching. "I'm not telling you to change everything tomorrow. I'm telling you there's a design problem worth looking at before the spring drive puts 400 animals under this equipment for 3 weeks. The room was quiet. Russ Tamblyn set the paper down and said, without looking up, "The canvas numbers are right. I've been losing dry goods to moisture every third drive for 15 years and always blame the river crossings." He looked at Marin. "What kind of seam sealing are you talking about?" After that, the conversation shifted, and it shifted because Tamblyn was the most credible person at the table, and he had validated something, and the others adjusted accordingly. Not Beckett. Beckett remained cordial and skeptical in equal measure, which was his professional default, but Osley started actually asking questions rather than positioning ones, and Dale Pruitt, who had not said a single word, began making small marks on the agenda paper that suggested he was writing things down. It was not a triumph. She had not walked out of there with a contract or a consensus, but the argument had been made in the room that needed to hear it, and it had been made well, and Coulter knew that Russ Tamblyn would be thinking about it for the next 2 weeks. The gossip started the following Monday. Coulter had expected something. Red Flint was a town that ran on information the way other towns ran on water, and any variation from the expected pattern of his life was immediately processed by a social mechanism that had been refined over years of close attention to who talked to whom and why. What he had not fully anticipated was the specific texture of it, which was less about him and more about her, and less curious than contemptuous. He heard the first version from Ned, who reported it with the discomfort of a man who knew the news wasn't good and hadn't figured out yet whether he was obligated to say it. "There's talk about the woman from Sutter Lane," Ned said. They were in the barn, checking a horse that had thrown a shoe on the north pasture fence line, and Ned had the particular stillness of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that says she's got her hooks in you." Ned looked at the horse's hoof. "People are saying she showed up to the cattlemen's meeting uninvited and made a fool of herself, and that there's a reason you keep going to her shop." Coulter was quiet for a moment. "Who's saying it?" "It's not one person," Ned said carefully. "It's the kind of thing that's already in 3 places." He knew what that meant. Something put into motion deliberately, something that had more than one starting point, which meant it had been coordinated rather than just started. He asked Tamblyn, who had no reason to lie to him in some years of honest dealing behind them. Tamblyn, when pressed, confirmed that within 2 days of the cattlemen's meeting, there had been conversations at the hotel bar and at the feed exchange that all carried the same basic content. Marin Holloway had arrived at the meeting without being properly invited, had presented unproven ideas as established fact, and had done so because she had cultivated a personal relationship with Coulter Vance that had nothing to do with cattle or equipment. "Anyone saying where they heard it first?" Coulter asked. Tamblyn shrugged. "The Beckett boy was at the hotel the night it started. That's all I know." Harlow Beckett's son Clay was 21 and ambitious in the directionless way of young men who have inherited their father's confidence without yet earning anything that warranted it. Whether Harlow had set him to it or Clay had done it on his own initiative didn't much matter in practical terms. The Becketts had decided that Marin Holloway was a problem and had taken the available action against her, which was to make her a subject of exactly the kind of talk that stuck in small towns, and was almost impossible to disprove because it had no specific content to refute. The town had obliged. Coulter heard it in bits over the following week, at the supply exchange from a ranch hand who reported it thinking he was being helpful, from Adelaide Beckett herself, who appeared at his ranch with a pie that was clearly a pretext, and who managed to work into the conversation within 10 minutes that she'd heard the seamstress from Sutter Lane had been making a nuisance of herself at important meetings, and honestly it was a shame that some people didn't know their place. He did not say anything to Adelaide that he would regret. He thanked her for the pie. It was genuinely good, and told her he had work to get back to, and walked her out to her buggy with the kind of measured courtesy that would be reported back to her father as encouraging, which he couldn't help, and then went back inside and stood in his front hall thinking about several things at once. He went to see Marin 2 days after Adelaide's visit. She was working when he came in, as she always was, this time on what looked like a set of canvas panniers for pack mules, large, flat-sided bags with complicated closure systems. She looked up when he entered, and something in his expression told her something, because she set down her work and waited. "You've heard," he said. "I heard within 3 days of the meeting," she said. "Margaret Foss, who does laundry on Depot Street, told me when she brought in a blouse repair. She meant it kindly. She wanted me to know." She paused. "Sit down, Mr. Vance. You look like you're deciding something." He sat in the chair by the stove. She went back to the panniers but held them without working, which was her way of listening while keeping her hands occupied. "I want to hire you formally," he said. "Not for repairs. For design and quality oversight on trail gear. Contract position, 3 months to start, renewable. Office out of my ranch or here, whichever you prefer. I want you working on the spring drive preparation." She was quiet for a long moment. "You know what that does to the talk." "I know. It goes from gossip to something that gets told differently, something that has more permanence to it." "I know that too." She looked at him. "Why?" The question was direct in the way her questions usually were. Not aggressive, just asking for the real answer rather than the one that sounded good. He had thought about how to answer it on the ride over, and he had decided that the version he would use in a business context, because your work is good and the ranch needs it, was true but incomplete, and she would know it was incomplete, and he didn't want to start a working arrangement with a version of things that wasn't the whole truth. "Because the work is real," he said. "And because the reason there's talk is that Beckett doesn't want you near this operation. And anything Harlow Beckett doesn't want me to do, I'm now inclined to look at more carefully." She absorbed this. "That's 2 reasons." "Yes." "The first one is enough to hire someone," she said. "The second one isn't a good reason on its own." "I know, but together they're honest." She was quiet for a while. The stove ticked. Outside, someone went by on the lane, boots on the cold ground quickly. 3 months, she said finally. "I keep the shop running on the side. I have regular customers who depend on me for alterations, and I won't leave them without someone." "That's fine. And if I disagree with you about a design decision, I say so and you hear it before you decide." "That's how I want it to work," he said. "I'm not hiring you to agree with me. I'm hiring you because your judgment is better than mine on these specific things." She looked at him for a moment, and he had the sense she was checking the statement against what she knew of him, measuring it for the truth of it. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her because she nodded. "All right," she said. "When do I start?" "Now," he said. "Tell me what's wrong with my panniers." She looked at him, and then she looked at the ones she'd been working on, and something moved across her face that might have been, briefly, amusement. "These are for the Garrity pack string on the East Route, not yours." "I know, but tell me anyway." And she did. The arrangement lasted exactly 9 days before Harlow Beckett came to visit. He came to the ranch, not to the shop, which told Coulter the visit was about him rather than about her. Beckett arrived on a Thursday afternoon, his good horse and his good coat, and took coffee in the front room and talked about Valley business for 20 minutes before he got to the point. "I've heard you've taken on the Holloway woman in some kind of formal capacity," he said. "Equipment consulting or some such." "That's right." "Coulter." Beckett set down his cup. "I've known you since you were nobody in this valley, and I say that with respect. You built something real, and I've never said otherwise. But this woman is a problem you're creating for yourself." "How so?" "She showed up at my meeting uninvited and presented half-finished theories to men who run serious operations. She's been seen going in and out of your ranch twice this week already, and the talk about what that means is, it's not quiet, is what I'm saying. I don't generally run my business decisions by the hotel bar," Coulter said. Beckett's jaw tightened slightly. "This isn't about the bar. I'm talking about the trust relationships you have with the men in this valley who matter. The Osley family has 300 head of cattle in a pooled drive with yours this spring. Dale Pruitt has a water rights agreement with you that comes up for renewal in September. These are men with wives and with opinions about how operations are run and who runs them. He paused. This is a practical problem, is what I'm saying. And if I told you the canvas work she's doing for the spring drive is going to save this operation $400 in goods losses and reduce livestock injury rates, then I'd say there are other people who could do that work without the complications she brings. Coulter looked at him. Name one. Beckett said nothing for a moment. That's not the point. It is the point, Coulter said, without heat. I've been in this valley 12 years. I've dealt with every supplier and outfitter and leather worker inside of 50 miles. Nobody else is doing what she's doing. Nobody else has looked at this problem. She found it and she solved it, and if the only objection is that she lives on Sutter Lane and came to your meeting and made Dale Pruitt write things down, then that's not a business argument, Harlow. That's something else. The silence that followed had weight. Beckett picked up his coffee cup, looked at it, set it down. I'm telling you as a friend, he said, that this is going to cost you. I appreciate that, Coulter said. I'll keep it in mind. Beckett left 20 minutes later. From the window, Coulter watched his good horse carry him back down the lane toward the main road, and he stood there until the figure disappeared behind the tree line, and then he turned and walked back through the house to his desk, where he had a spring drive contract sitting half reviewed, and he sat down and went back to work. What came next came from several directions at once, which was how coordinated things worked in a small valley. 3 of Coulter's contracts for supply shipments to the spring drive failed to arrive. Not canceled, just disappeared. The feed merchant on the edge of town who had supplied grain to the Vance Ranch for 4 years suddenly had no available inventory for the next 3 months. A lumber delivery for fence repair came short by 40 posts, and when Ned tracked down the reason, the supplier said the order had been amended. Someone had written in a reduced quantity with an initial that looked like Coulter's but wasn't quite on close examination. 2 ranch hands left within the same week. They both gave different reasons. One said he'd been offered better wages at the Pruitt spread. The other said he wanted to work closer to town. But they left 4 days apart, which was a coincidence that Coulter filed under the category of things that were not coincidences. The supply problems were recoverable, at cost and inconvenience. The hands were irritating because they took institutional knowledge with them, things learned over seasons rather than weeks. But the truly damaging thing, the thing that hit when Coulter had his back turned to it, was the contract. He had an agreement with 3 smaller independent ranchers to pool their cattle with his for the spring drive, which reduced costs for all of them and gave Coulter the numbers to justify the route north through the better grazing passes. The 3 ranchers were not powerful men. They were working operations, families with 50 to 100 head each, people for whom the spring drive was the financial event of the year. They sent a joint letter which arrived on a Tuesday and which Coulter read at his desk with the controlled expression of a man processing something he should have anticipated but hadn't quite. The letter said they were withdrawing from the pooling arrangement. It was politely worded. It cited changed circumstances, without naming what those circumstances were. It was signed by all 3, which meant someone had gotten to all 3, probably at the same time, probably at the same table. Ned, when he read it, said what Coulter was thinking. That's the spring drive, then. Without their numbers, we can't justify the north route, and if we take the south route, we lose the grazing, and we're looking at losing 20% of the herd condition before we even reach the railhead. I know what it means, Coulter said. So what do we do? Coulter sat there looking at the letter for a moment. Then he folded it and set it on the corner of the desk with the careful deliberateness of a man deciding not to react to something until he had thought through it properly. We go anyway, he said. Ned stared at him. With our numbers alone, that's barely worth the cost of the drive. We go anyway, Coulter said again, and we go right. Get me a meeting with Marin tomorrow. I want to talk about the drive preparation, and I want to start those conversations now, before anything else breaks loose. He didn't say what he was thinking, which was that something had shifted in the last 3 weeks from social pressure to organized damage, and that the difference between those 2 things was significant. Social pressure was people expressing displeasure. Organized damage was people making calculated moves, and calculated moves left traces. He was going to need those traces. The meeting Coulter called for the following morning happened at the ranch. Not at the shop, because he needed Ned in the room and he needed the maps, and the maps were pinned to the wall in his office where they had lived for 3 years. Marin arrived at 7, earlier than he'd asked, and Ned was already there with coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in, and the three of them stood around the desk looking at the route charts while the early light came through the window at a flat winter angle that made everything look like it was being examined rather than simply seen. Coulter laid it out plainly. The pooling agreement was gone. That dropped them from roughly 480 head to the Vance Ranch's own 312, which was enough cattle to make the drive technically worthwhile, but not enough to justify the northern route with its better grazing and its higher final price at the railhead. The southern route was shorter, but the grazing was poor through the middle section, and cattle that arrived at market, undersized and trail-thin, sold for less per head, which ate into the margin until there was barely a margin left. "We could wait," Ned said. "See if the smaller ranchers come back around once Beckett's pressure shifts to something else." "The drive window is 6 weeks," Coulter said. "If we wait too long, we hit the heat in the canyon section and lose another 10% of condition. We go when the season says to go." Ned looked at the map. "Then we go south, and we lose money. Or we go north and figure out how to do it with our numbers alone." Coulter looked at Marin. "Tell me what the real obstacles are on the north route." She had been quiet through the exchange, which was her way in rooms with more than one person. She listened longer than most people were comfortable with before she said anything, and what she said when she finally said it was generally the thing everyone else had been circling without landing on. She leaned forward and put her finger on the map at a point about 2/3 of the way up the northern route, a place where the trail narrowed as it passed through a canyon section before opening back out onto the high plateau grazing. "Garrow Canyon," she said. "The trail through it is wide enough for 4 animals abreast at the narrowest point. With your numbers, you're looking at a column that takes almost 3 hours to move through from tail to head. That's the choke point. Everything else on the north route is about timing and water management, which is workable. But if anything goes wrong in the canyon, weather, a spooked herd, a blocked crossing at the far end, you're trapped with 300 animals in a rock corridor." "That's always been true of the north route," Ned said. "We've run it 4 times. You've run it 4 times with 480 head and full crews. You're doing it now with 200 less cattle and—" She looked at Coulter. "How many hands did you lose?" "2, he said. "We're down to 11 working riders for the drive." She straightened up. 11 riders for 300 head through canyon terrain is lean, not impossible. But you have no margin for problems. "So what do you suggest?" Coulter asked. Not with the tone of a man looking for permission, with the tone of a man who had asked someone he trusted for their actual opinion. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I suggest we spend the 2 weeks before the drive making sure there are no problems." It was not an inspiring statement on its face, but what followed it was 3 hours of specific, detailed work that covered equipment checks, water caching points, contingency crossing sites, and a revised loading plan for the supply wagons that Marin had been developing based on her canvas work. By the time they were done, the map on the wall had new marks on it, and Ned had filled 2 pages of notes, and the morning had turned into afternoon without any of them particularly noticing. Seth's Coulter made his announcement at the Drover's Rest Saloon on Friday evening, which was where working ranchers and their hands came for the end of the week, and which was therefore the most efficient single location for information to enter the Red Flint ecosystem and spread from there. He didn't make a speech. He simply told 3 men he knew at the bar, in a normal conversational voice, that the Vance Spring Drive was going north through Garrow Canyon on the 15th, and that Marin Holloway was running drive preparation. The silence that followed was the kind that happened when a room didn't stop its noise all at once, but rather staggered to a halt, one conversation at a time, like candles being blown out from one end of a table to the other. Someone, he thought it was one of the Osley ranch hands, a big man named Curtin, said, from across the room, "The Seamstress?" "The equipment and logistics coordinator," Coulter said. He drank his beer. "She's been working on the drive prep for 3 weeks. The gear is better than it's been in 4 years, and the route plan is solid." He left shortly after, because he had said what he came to say, and staying longer would have turned it into a performance. Behind him, as he went through the door, he could hear the room reassembling itself around the information he'd left in it. Ned, walking out beside him, said, "Half those men are going to think you've lost your mind." "About half," Coulter agreed. "The other half will wait to see what happens. And if something goes wrong on the drive, then we deal with it," Coulter said. "Same as always. What?" The 2 weeks before the drive were the most productive stretch of preparation Coulter had seen on the ranch in years, and they were not smooth, and he would not have described them as pleasant. Marin worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that the margin for error was narrow and was treating every decision accordingly. She was at the ranch by 7 most mornings, and often still there when the light got low, either in the equipment barn going through harnesses with a systematic thoroughness that made Ned's head ache, or in the supply yard checking canvas seals on the wagon covers with her hands, running every seam between her fingers. The ranch hands did not know what to make of her, which was a condition they expressed in the usual ways, ignoring her when possible, complying with her requests with the minimal grace of men doing what they were told rather than what they chose, and conducting among themselves a running commentary that they took care not to direct at her, but also took minimal care to keep out of earshot. She was aware of this. Coulter was aware that she was aware of it. Neither of them addressed it directly, because addressing it directly would have required a conversation about respect that would have changed nothing in the short term, and possibly made things worse. What changed things, as it turned out, was the harnesses. On the 6th day of preparation, she had Ned pull all 11 working harnesses from the barn for inspection. She went through them one by one on a pair of sawhorses she'd set up in the yard, examining each one with the same combination of visual assessment and hand feel that Coulter had first seen in the shop on Sutter Lane. The ranch hands drifted in to watch, ostensibly busy with other things in the vicinity. She annotated each harness with chalk marks, white for problems requiring immediate repair, yellow for things that would hold through the drive but needed attention after. 7 of the 11 got white marks somewhere. A hand named Poole, who had been among the most vocally skeptical in the running commentary, looked at the marks on his working harness and said, with more honesty than he probably intended, "That's the one my horse has been throwing weight wrong with for 3 weeks. I thought it was the horse." "It's not the horse," Marin said, without looking up from the next harness. "The left trace is a half-inch short relative to the right. Over a full day's pull, it creates asymmetric loading, and the animal compensates by adjusting its stride, which shows up as what looks like a gait problem." She set down the harness she was holding. "Bring him to the yard tomorrow morning, and I'll show you." Poole showed up the next morning with the horse, and she did show him, and he stood there watching with his hat in his hands and the particular expression of a man revising a position he hadn't examined closely enough. He didn't say anything about his revision. Men like Poole rarely did. But after that, he stopped being the voice in the running commentary. And when he stopped, the commentary itself became quieter, and then mostly stopped. The cook wagon canvas was replaced entirely with the tighter weave Marin had been advocating since the cattlemen's meeting, and the difference in weight was 34 pounds. She had Ned put the old and new covers on a scale in front of whoever happened to be nearby, without comment, because the number spoke well enough for itself. The supply panniers were repacked according to a loading diagram she produced that distributed weight differently than the ranch's standard practice, putting heavier goods lower and closer to center, and when they hitched the supply wagon and took it out for a test run on the north hill behind the barn, it tracked straighter on the grade than Ned had seen it track in the 4 years he'd been managing the ranch. "She's been right about everything she's touched," he told Coulter on the 9th evening. "I need you to know that I'm saying that having started out skeptical." "I know where you started," Coulter said. "It doesn't make it easier when the drive goes sideways for reasons we didn't expect," Ned said carefully. "Nothing makes that easier," Coulter said. "That's just the drive." They left on the 15th at first light, 312 head, moving out of the Vance Ranch's south pasture gate in the gray pre-dawn with 11 riders spread along the column and the 2 supply wagons at the rear. The morning was cold and clear, which was the best weather they could have hoped for, and the cattle moved out settled rather than fractious, which was partly good handling and partly the fact that they had been worked quietly for the previous 3 days to take the restlessness out of them before the road. Marin rode with the supply wagons for the first day, which was the flattest section of the route and which went smoothly in the way that first days usually did, when animals and men were fresh and the problems hadn't started yet. She was not a natural rider in the way that someone who had grown up on ranches was a natural rider, but she was competent and she was not afraid of the horse, and she kept her attention on the wagons and on the column ahead with a steady alertness that Coulter noted from his position riding the right flank. The second day was harder. The trail climbed into the first of the ridge sections, and the cattle that had moved smoothly on flat ground now had to negotiate grade and rockier footing, and the column stretched and compressed in the uneven way of a herd dealing with terrain. Two animals tried to break east toward a draw that smelled of water that wasn't on the route, and the riders who went after them came back with their horses blowing, and one of the younger hands, a boy named Cress, who was on his first major drive, looking rattled and pale. Marin came up the column on the third morning and found Coulter talking to the trail boss, a 20-year veteran named Gil Hodder, who had signed on 3 weeks earlier after answering the ad Coulter had put out quietly through Ned. Hodder was competent in the way of a man who knew his own limits clearly, which was different from brilliant but more reliable in sustained difficult conditions. "The canyon section is tomorrow," Hodder said. He had a map of his own, well used, the paper soft from folding and unfolding. "If the weather holds." "What's the timing look like?" Coulter asked. "Entry at first light. Out the far end by early afternoon if we don't have stops." Hodder glanced at Marin. "You want her thinking about the canyon crossing? She should know that the bridge at the far end is timber over a seasonal creek. Dry this time of year, but the bridge hasn't been inspected in I don't know how long." Marin looked up from the map she was holding, her own copy, the one from Coulter's office with the chalk additions. "Which bridge?" "Kellner's Crossing, about 200 yards from the canyon exit." She was quiet. Then, "I know that crossing. I passed through Garrow Canyon once, about 8 months ago, taking supplies up to a farm on the plateau. The bridge was sound then, but one of the main support timbers had old rot in it. I noticed it because the sag was visible when I drove the supply wagon over. I didn't have reason to report it to anyone at the time." Hodder looked at her. "A supply wagon and 300 head of cattle is a different load." "Yes," she said. "That's why I'm telling you now." The conversation that followed was practical and somewhat tense, which was appropriate given the circumstances. They had 3 options: attempt Kellner's Crossing and hope the timber held, find another way across the creek bed, or turn around and take the southern route, which at this point in the drive would cost them 3 days of backtracking and put them into the southern heat window that Coulter had been trying to avoid. "What's the creek bed like?" Marin asked Hodder. "Below the bridge." He shrugged. "Dry. Rocky in spots." "Wide?" "Not very. 20 feet maybe." She looked at the map. "If we can get the wagons across without the bridge, the cattle can follow the creek bed itself. Animals will cross a dry creek bed with less resistance than a bridge anyway." "The bank drop," Hodder said. "There's a reason there's a bridge." "How much of a drop?" 3-4 feet on the near side." She chewed on that for a moment. "What about the mining access road? The one that used to run to the Fenwick claim?" She pointed to a line on the map that was faint, clearly old. "If that road is still passable, it comes out below the Kellner Bridge, on the far side of the creek. We'd bypass the bridge entirely." Hodder looked at the map line. "That road's been closed for years. I don't know what condition it's in." "Someone should ride out and check it," she said. Coulter looked at her. "Tonight." "Tonight," she agreed. "Before we're in the canyon, and the decision is already made for us." He sent 2 riders out before supper. They came back in the dark, having ridden hard, and reported that the mining road was overgrown but passable for wagons, with some clearance work. Fallen brush in 2 sections, nothing structural. One of them had a bleeding cut on his forearm from pushing through heavy growth in the dark, which he reported with more pride than complaint, and Marin cleaned it and bound it with a strip of linen from the supply wagon without being asked. "Can you clear it in the morning before the main column gets there?" she asked Hodder. "With 3 men and an hour, yes." "Then that's what we do." What actually happened in Garrow Canyon the next day was not the disaster that the circumstances seemed to be building toward, and it was not a clean passage either, and the truth of it was somewhere in the ugly, effortful middle where most real things happened. They entered the canyon at first light as planned, the column moving well in the cool air, the cattle steady. The canyon walls were high enough to throw the early light into a long blue shadow that didn't lift until mid-morning, and in that cold dimness, the sound of 300 animals moving through rock was something that got into the body, a low, sustained percussion that you felt in your chest rather than heard with your ears. The riders kept the flanks tight against the walls, keeping the column narrow and moving forward, and for the first 2 hours it went as planned. Then the water came. Not from the sky. The sky was still clear, the pale winter blue that promised nothing and kept its promise. It came from somewhere up in the ridge above the canyon's north wall, a snowmelt release that had been building behind a natural ice dam and chose that particular morning to let go. The sound of it arrived about 30 seconds before the water did, a low rushing that was completely different from the sound of the cattle or the wind, something with momentum behind it, and Hodder heard it first and shouted something that the canyon walls distorted into near incomprehensibility, but whose urgency needed no clarification. The water came into the canyon floor at the point where the trail narrowed to its tightest. Of course it did, because this was the kind of day that arranged its problems in the worst possible sequence. And it came in a sheet rather than a wave, maybe 8 inches deep over the rock floor at its highest, but moving fast enough to be unstable footing for animals already confined and already nervous. The front third of the herd went through the wet section before the full flow hit. The middle third hit the water when it was at its peak, and the result was exactly what Hodder and Coulter and every experienced rider in the canyon had been hoping to prevent. The column compressed, animals at the rear pushing into animals in the middle that had stopped because the animals ahead of them had stopped. And somewhere in that compression, a cluster of maybe 40 cattle broke sideways against the canyon wall and jammed there, bawling, unable to go forward or back. The riders went to work. This was what 11 experienced men on horses could do that no plan fully accounted for. The instinctive, practiced response to chaos that came from years of understanding how cattle moved and stopped and started again, and which could not be managed from a distance but only from inside the problem. Coulter was on the right flank of the jam, his horse reading the cattle below with the quiet intelligence of a well-trained working animal, pushing gently into the edge of the group and then backing off, trying to create a direction. Marin was at the rear with the wagons, which was where she was supposed to be, and in the first minutes of the crisis that was correct. The wagons needed to hold at the back of the formation and not push into the compressed column. But the second wagon's team, a pair of draft horses that were good animals on open ground and less good in confined spaces with panicking cattle noise around them, began to react badly. The driver, a ranch hand named Severin, who was competent in most things and less competent with frightened horses, was losing the argument with them. She climbed down from the first wagon and went to the team's heads. This was not a heroic moment. She grabbed the left horse's bridle and held it, and talked to the animal in a low, continuous voice that Severin couldn't hear from the seat, but that the horse could feel through her hands. And she stood there in the water, which was cold enough to be serious and moving fast enough to require bracing, and held on while the horse sorted out that the person at its head was not as frightened as the horse was, which was the most that could be communicated but turned out to be enough. The jam in the canyon broke after about 25 minutes. Not cleanly. 5 animals had to be physically turned and guided individually, which took 2 riders working very close to the wall. And when the column finally started moving again, it moved with the shaky, accelerated energy of a crowd that had been stopped and released, which required the riders to stay wide and keep the flanks contained until the pace settled. 3 animals came out the far end of the canyon with cuts from the wall rock. None of them were serious. It took the column nearly an hour longer than planned to reach the Kellner crossing point, and by then Hodder's advance men had the mining road cleared and marked, and the wagons took it without incident, and the cattle followed the creek bed across with the relative calm of animals that had already been through something worse and were done arguing about it. On the far side, on the plateau grass that was the first good grazing of the drive, Coulter rode back along the emerging column counting animals. He reached the rear where the wagons had stopped and where Marin was sitting on a boulder with her boots off, wringing water out of her socks with the practical focus of someone dealing with the most immediate problem at hand. Her feet were red from the cold. She had been standing in that water for the better part of half an hour. He said nothing immediately. He got down from his horse and went to the supply wagon and found the dry wool socks that were in the emergency kit and brought them back and held them out without comment. She looked at the socks, then at him, and there was something briefly unguarded in her expression that she covered quickly with the customary practicality. She took the socks. "All animals accounted for?" she asked. 312, he said. "All of them." She nodded, pulling the dry sock onto her left foot. "The team on the second wagon needs better handling training before the next drive. Severin is good with the reins on open ground, but he goes to pieces with noise." "I know," he said. "You should have someone work with him on it before fall." "I'll do that," he said. She stood up, testing her weight. "The mining road? I want to report it to the county surveyor as a viable alternative crossing when we get back. Someone should get that information down officially before another drive tries Kellner's Bridge and finds out the hard way." He looked at her. She had been in a flooded canyon 2 hours ago, had held a panicking draft team with her bare hands in cold running water, had come out the other side with wet feet and 312 cattle on the right bank, and her present concern was filing a route report with the county surveyor. "We'll do that," he said. "Good." She picked up her wet socks and looked at them and apparently decided there was nothing useful left to do with them and set them on the rock. "What's the grazing situation between here and the plateau?" "Fair to good for the next 6 miles, he said. "After that we hit the high grass." "Then we should push through the fair section today and get them onto the high grass before we camp. Let them graze out the stress." Potter, who had ridden back to check on the wagons, arrived in time to hear this last part. He looked at Marin, then at Coulter, with the expression of a man updating a prior assessment. He didn't say anything about it, which was his way. He simply nodded, turned his horse, and started back up the column to pass along the instruction. The drive continued. The cattle grazed. The afternoon came in clear and cold over the high plateau, and by the time they made camp that evening, 312 animals were settled in the high grass with the particular contentment of cattle that had eaten well, and 11 riders were at the fire with the exhaustion and the specific relief of men who had been through something difficult and had come out with their numbers intact. Marin sat at the edge of the fire circle with a tin cup of coffee, the borrowed dry socks still on her feet, making notes by firelight in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. Coulter sat across from her, not close enough to read what she was writing, watching the fire and thinking about several things at once. Poole, sitting to Coulter's left, said quietly and to nobody in particular, "She held that team for 30 minutes in moving water." Nobody responded to this directly. But around the fire, something shifted in the way men sat and where they looked. And in the morning, when they broke camp, the distribution of the work happened differently. Not dramatically, but in the small ways that revealed changed assumptions, like who called to whom for help with a cinch strap, and whether the response came quickly or slowly. It was not admiration exactly. It was closer to what happened when you watch someone do a hard thing competently under bad conditions. Not inspired by it, not converted to any particular feeling about the person, just recalibrated, having adjusted your estimate of what was there. They had 6 more days to the railhead. The high grass was as good as the route promised, and the cattle recovered condition fast on good grazing, and the rest of the drive was hard in the ordinary ways of drives, rather than in the exceptional way of that morning in the canyon. By the time they reached the railhead, and Coulter stood at the scale house watching the animals move through the chute, the numbers that came back were better than he'd projected, better than he would have gotten on the southern route, better than the margin that the lost pooling agreement had seemed to foreclose. He stood there with the tally paper in his hand for a long moment, before he folded it and put it in his coat pocket, and then he looked out at the holding pens where the last of the Vance cattle were being sorted, and then he looked for Marin, who was 50 yards away talking to the wagon driver about the return load, and holding her notebook in one hand and gesturing with the other, and he thought about what Beckett had said. This is going to cost you. It had cost him something. It had cost him 2 ranch hands and 3 supply contracts and a pooling agreement and 2 weeks of grinding logistics work and 1 very bad morning in a flooded canyon. He looked at the tally paper in his pocket and at the woman across the yard who was arguing about weight distribution with a wagon driver who had 20 years on her and was clearly losing the argument, and he allowed himself a feeling he didn't examine too closely, because examining it would have made it complicated in ways he wasn't quite ready for. The drive had come through. That was what he knew. The rest of it could wait until they were home. The return from the railhead took 4 days. which was 2 days longer than the drive out because they were traveling with empty wagons and tired horses and no particular urgency, and Coulter used the time to think. He was not a man who thought loudly. He didn't talk through problems with Ned or sleep on decisions or pace rooms at night in the way of men who needed their worry to be visible in order to feel like they were doing something about it. He thought the way he rode, steadily, without much visible effort, covering ground that didn't announce itself as progress until you looked back and saw how far you'd come. On the return from the railhead, he sat in the saddle for 4 days and let the problem organize itself in his mind, which was his process, and by the time Red Flint appeared on the horizon on the 4th afternoon, he had a shape for what needed doing. The supply problems had not been bad luck. He had known this since the feed merchant's convenient inventory shortage and the amended lumber order with the almost right initials. What he hadn't had was proof that connected those events to anyone specific, because coordinated damage was only useful if it couldn't be traced back, and the people who had arranged it were not careless. But Marin's record-keeping changed the equation. He had understood, in a general way, that she kept careful notes. He had seen the notebook at the fire on the drive, had seen the annotation system she used on harnesses, had watched her produce pages of observations for the cattlemen's meeting when most consultants would have offered opinions. What he had not fully appreciated until she spread it across his desk on the evening they returned was the scope of what she had been tracking since the first week she came on as a contractor. She had a ledger. Not the ranch's ledger. Ned kept that, and it was accurate as far as it went, but a parallel record she had built from her own observations and from the documentation that passed through her hands in the course of doing the work. Every supply order she had been involved with, every harness and canvas inspection, every conversation that had touched on materials or deliveries, she had recorded dates, quantities, descriptions, and this was the part that made Coulter sit forward in his chair, discrepancies. I started keeping it because of Grantley, she said. She was standing across the desk from him, the ledger open between them. After what happened with the lease, I decided I would never again be in a position where someone could change the terms of something I was party to, and I wouldn't have a record of what the original terms were. When did you start noticing discrepancies? The 3rd week. The grain shipment. She turned to a page near the front. The order called for 600 pounds of trail mix grain for the supply wagons. What arrived was 460. The delivery receipt said 600. I weighed it myself on the barn scale because it looked short. He looked at the page. The number was written in her small, precise hand, with a date and the name of the freight hauler, and a notation that she had observed the unloading and measured the delivered weight against the documented weight. You didn't say anything at the time. I told Ned there was a discrepancy. He said it might be a weighing error at the source and reordered the shortfall. She turned a few pages. Then it happened again with the canvas bolts. Order said 40 yards, delivered 31. Same receipt method. The delivery paper said 40. And again with the dried beef for the cook wagon. He sat back. 3 times before the drive. 4. The 4th was the fence post Ned tracked. The reduced order with the wrong initials. I have a note on that one too because I happened to be in the supply yard when the delivery came and I saw the paperwork. The amendment was added to the original order form in different ink, slightly darker. Whoever did it had the original form and added to it rather than creating a new document. You wrote that down. I wrote everything down. She said it without self-congratulation, just as a fact about how she worked. I didn't know at the time what it added up to. I do now. Coulter looked at the ledger. The pattern was clear when you could see it assembled in one place. 4 separate supply incidents, each of which looked like a vendor error or a paperwork problem in isolation, and each of which followed the same basic structure, correct documentation on paper, short delivery in reality. It required someone who had access to the supply order forms before delivery, who could either redirect quantities or substitute documentation, and who had a relationship with enough different vendors to make it look like unrelated coincidences. The freight company, he said, the same freighter for 3 of the 4. She turned to the back of the ledger where she had made a summary page. Galton Freight. They do most of the supply hauling in this part of the valley. I checked their rate sheet and their listed contract clients. She set a piece of paper beside the ledger. Harlow Beckett is one of their primary accounts. Has been for 7 years according to the public rate filings at the county office. He looked at the paper, then at her. When did you get this? Before the drive. I went to the county record office and looked at the freight filings because I wanted to understand who had leverage over which vendors. She paused. I didn't tell you at the time because I didn't have enough to say anything useful. I had a pattern and a connection, but not causation. And now? Now we have the drive results, which means we have proof that the sabotage didn't work. And I have 4 documented discrepancies with a freight company connected to Beckett, plus the timing. All of it happening after the cattleman's meeting, after he came to talk to you. She looked at him steadily. That's not proof of a criminal act, but it's enough for a public conversation. He sat with this for a while. Outside, the ranch was quieting into its evening sounds. The horses settling, someone closing the barn door. Ned's voice at some distance giving a direction to one of the hands. The lamp on the desk threw a warm circle that made the edges of the room dark and made the ledger on the desk look like the most important object in a small, lit world. There are 3 ranchers who pulled out of the pooling agreement, he said. I know. If what happened to my supply chain happened to them, if someone told them their own operations were at risk if they stayed in, they wouldn't necessarily know they'd been manipulated. They'd just know they'd made a decision for reasons that seemed good at the time. She nodded slowly. You'd want to talk to them before you do anything public. Give them the chance to understand what they were part of. Yes. He closed the ledger. Can I keep this? I made a copy, she said, before the drive. It's in the shop. He looked at her. Of course you did. Something moved at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. I told you, Grantley taught me to keep records. He went to see Walt Greer first, because Walt was the most straightforward of the 3 ranchers, and because his operation was the closest, a 40-minute ride east of Red Flint on the near side of the river. Walt was a 50-year-old man who ran 80 head in a small hay operation and who had built everything he had with his wife Clara over 22 years. And he was the kind of man who was embarrassed by things he couldn't immediately explain and angry about things that turned out to be someone else's fault. And Coulter judged that the conversation needed to happen with Walt first, because if Walt came around, the other 2 would follow. He found Walt in his hay barn, fixing the tines on a pitchfork, in the way of a man who was occupying his hands while his mind was elsewhere. Walt looked up when Coulter came in and immediately had the expression of a man who had been expecting an unpleasant conversation and was registering relief that it was finally happening. Coulter, he said. Walt. Coulter came in out of the cold. The drive came back. I heard. Walt set down the pitchfork. I heard it went well, in spite of, He stopped. In spite of going short on numbers, Coulter said. Yes, it went well. Walt was quiet. He was a man who showed his discomfort in his hands. He picked up the pitchfork and set it down again, picked up a piece of wire, set that down too. Look, he said, I know what you're here about, and I need you to know that withdrawing from that agreement wasn't... He stopped again. It wasn't an easy decision. What made it? Coulter asked. Not accusing, just asking. Walt looked at the barn floor for a moment. I got a visit from Dale Pruitt about 3 weeks before the drive. He said there were concerns among the valley operators about the direction things were going at the Vance Ranch. He said some of the larger operators were thinking about consolidating their pooling agreements differently, pulling toward the Beckett operation for the spring drive. He said if I stayed in your pool and Beckett's group moved against you in the market, my cattle would go to market on a damaged route at a bad time, and I'd take a loss I couldn't absorb. He said Beckett's group. He implied it. He was careful not to name it directly. Walt finally put the wire down and kept it down. I have Clara and the 2 boys and 80 head, Coulter. If I take a significant loss, I don't have much to fall back on. I understand that, Coulter said. He meant it. What I need you to understand is that the thing Pruitt described, the consolidated market action against my operation, it wasn't an organic decision by valley operators. It was Beckett's plan, and Pruitt was delivering Beckett's message. He laid it out then, simply and without dramatics. The supply discrepancies, the freight company connection, the timing of the pooling withdrawals relative to the cattlemen's meeting. He didn't show the ledger. He described what was in it. The three of you withdrawing was the pressure they put on that they thought would cancel the drive. When the drive went anyway, and went well, the pressure didn't achieve its purpose. Walt listened. His face went through several things during this. Discomfort, then the sharper expression of a man connecting events he'd experienced but not understood, then something harder and less pleasant that was close to anger. Pruitt was in it with him, Walt said. Pruitt delivered the message. Whether he understood what he was part of, I don't know. That's a question I'd rather let him answer himself. Coulter paused. What I want from you is simple. I want to know what you were told and when, and I want that in writing if you're willing, because what I have is a pattern of documented damage, and your account fills in a piece of the picture I don't have otherwise. Walt was quiet for a long moment. Clara appeared in the barn doorway from the house, looking at her husband with the attentive expression of a woman who had learned to read the quality of silences involving her household's livelihood. What are you going to do with it? Walt asked. I'm going to present it publicly, Coulter said. Not in a courtroom. In the cattlemen's hall, where this started, in front of the men who were there when Beckett decided a woman from Sutter Lane was a problem he needed to solve. Walt looked at Clara, who was still in the doorway, and something passed between them that was the compressed communication of long marriage. A whole conversation in the space of 2 seconds. All right, Walt said. Tell me what you need written down. Oh, the other two ranchers, Sam Pollard and Ike Voss, required similar conversations over the following 2 days, and neither was as straightforward as Walt. Pollard was defensive in the way of a man who knew he'd been used and wasn't ready to say so out loud. And it took an hour and 20 minutes of careful, patient exchange before he stopped defending the decision he'd made and started looking at the circumstances that had shaped it. Voss was simply frightened, a man with a smaller operation than the others and a larger debt load. And Coulter sat in his kitchen with a cup of coffee that went cold and told him flatly that the danger he was afraid of had already been shown to be manageable because the drive had come through without him, and the thing that was less manageable was staying in Beckett's shadow indefinitely. In the end, both gave him written accounts. Not identical. Each described what they'd been told in their own words and from their own vantage, but consistent in the essential details, which was that they had each been visited by someone connected to the Beckett operation and told that staying with the Vance pooling agreement was a financial risk they couldn't afford. He brought everything to Marin on the third evening. She was at the shop, which was where she had returned to her regular work during the days he was out making visits, and she was at the cutting table with a shirt repair for a customer, and a cup of tea that had gone cold on the edge of the table. He spread the written accounts beside her ledger, and they sat across from each other and went through it. It's enough, she said, after a long while. For a public presentation, he said. Not for a legal action, necessarily. The freight company angle would need a lawyer who could pull the internal order records. Do you want a legal action? He thought about it honestly. I want Beckett to not be able to do this again. To me or to anyone else in this valley. Whether that requires a courthouse or just a room full of people who understand what happened. I'll take whichever one gets there. She was quiet, looking at the papers. There are other people in this ledger, she said. Not just the supply incidents. The two hands who left, one of them had a conversation with Clay Beckett 2 weeks before he resigned. I saw them talking at the feed exchange and made a note because I thought it was worth noting. I don't know what was said. I can probably find out, Coulter said. Poole knows both of them well. He might know if something was offered. Find out before you call the meeting, she said. If someone was paid to leave your employ and you can show that, it closes the remaining gaps in the pattern. He looked at her. You've been thinking about this since before the drive. I've been thinking about it since the 3rd week, she said. Since the grain shipment. She met his eyes without apology. I was hired to do work for this ranch and people were interfering with that work for reasons that had nothing to do with the work. I wanted to understand what was happening. She paused. I also understand what it costs when someone has more power than you and decides to use it, and the only way to survive that is to know more about their actions than they think you know. Grantley again. He didn't say it out loud. He had learned not to name her losses back to her. But he thought it, and he thought about the 4 years she had spent building a shop that someone had taken from her because she hadn't known what was in her own contract. She had spent 3 years since then building something different. Not just work, but the habits and tools that meant she would never again be caught without a record. "I want to call the meeting for next Thursday," he said. "The Cattleman's Hall. Same room." "Same room is right," she said. Getting Beckett into the meeting without alerting him to its purpose required a version of the truth that was simply incomplete. Coulter sent a formal note through the association's secretary requesting a special session to present the spring drive results and their implications for valley-wide equipment standards, which was accurate and which had the additional merit of making it professionally awkward for Beckett to decline, since the matter of equipment standards had originated in a meeting he had chaired. Pruitt and Osley received the same note. Tamblyn received a slightly different one, which included a brief line saying that Coulter had something to present that Tamblyn would want to hear, which was enough for a man who had learned to read what was under Coulter's words. The hall was set up the same way it had been in January. The long oak table, the fireplace too hot at one end, the framed documents on the wall. Marin arrived early again, but this time she didn't stand near the window. She sat at the table, in a chair 3 from the end, and she had the ledger in front of her and the rancher's written accounts in a folder, and she sat the way she worked, with the stillness of someone who had done their preparation and was ready. Beckett came in and saw the ledger, and something moved in his face that he controlled quickly, but not quickly enough. He sat at the head of the table with the practiced ease of a man claiming territory, and he looked at Coulter with the expression of a man who suspected a trap and was calculating his options. Osley and Pruitt came in together. Tamblyn came in alone, sat, and looked at the papers in front of Marin with the focused attention of someone who had been told there was something worth seeing. Walt Greer was in the room. He was not a member of the Cattlemen's Association, which technically made his presence irregular, but he had asked to come and Coulter had said yes, and he sat in a chair against the wall with Sam Pollard beside him and Ike Voss at the end. Beckett looked at the 3 ranchers against the wall and then looked at Coulter with an expression that had graduated from suspected trap to confirmed trap and was now deciding what to do about it. Coulter started with the drive results because they were real and because they established the context. He went through the numbers, the final tally at the railhead, the per-head price, the comparison to what the southern route would have returned, and he laid the tally sheet on the table where anyone could look at it. Then he set Marin's ledger beside it. "Before I get to the second part," he said, "I want everyone in this room to understand that the spring drive succeeded because of the work of a woman sitting at this table, and I want that stated plainly before anything else is said." Beckett said, "Coulter." "I'm not done," Coulter said without raising his voice. He went through the supply discrepancies the way Marin had gone through them with him, methodically, one at a time, each one documented in the ledger with dates and measurements and the name of the freight company. He put the Galton freight rate filing on the table, which was a public document, showing Beckett's account history. He noted the timing. Then he let Walt Greer speak. Walt was not a natural speaker in public settings, and he knew it. He stood up from his chair against the wall and said what he had to say, in the plain, slightly uncomfortable way of a man who had decided that the discomfort of saying it was less than the discomfort of not saying it. He described Pruitt's visit, what he had been told, and the decision he had made as a result of it. Pruitt, across the table, went very still. Pollard and Voss followed, each briefly, each with the same essential account in their own words. The room was quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. It was the quiet of a room full of people who were separately processing what they had just heard and arriving at conclusions that none of them had left the house expecting to reach that morning. Beckett sat at the head of the table with his hands folded and his face composed. He was a man who had survived a long time in a competitive valley by being better than most people at controlling what his face showed, and he was deploying that skill fully now. But there was a quality to the stillness that was different from confidence, something more effortful, like a man holding a door shut against pressure from the other side. "This is a serious set of accusations," he said, "circumstantial ones." "Some of them," Coulter said. "The freight connection is circumstantial. The ranchers' accounts are not. They describe what they were told and by whom." He looked at Pruitt. "Dale." Pruitt looked back at him. He was not a man who frightened easily, but he was a man who calculated. And what Coulter could see him calculating now was the difference between what had been survivable when Coulter's operation was weakened and what was survivable now that the drive had succeeded, and there was a table full of documentation and 3 separate ranchers' testimony. "I may have overstated the risk," Pruitt said carefully. It was not a confession. It was the version of acknowledgement that a cautious man made when the full version cost too much. But it was something. And in the specific social arithmetic of a small valley meeting, something was enough to change the shape of things. Beckett looked at Pruitt with an expression that was brief and cold, and which Coulter filed away. Tamblyn, who had not said anything since the meeting began, put both hands flat on the table. "I want to ask a direct question," he said. "Were supply shipments to this operation shorted deliberately, with knowledge, through the freight arrangement?" He was looking at Beckett. The room was looking at Beckett. "I manage a large number of commercial relationships," Beckett said. "I can't speak to the details of how my freight account handles individual transactions." "That's not an answer," Tamblyn said. "It's the only one I have," Beckett said. What happened after that was not dramatic in the way of a confession or a collapse, because things rarely were. Beckett did not admit to anything. He didn't have to, and he wouldn't, and pursuing it to a courthouse would have required a lawyer and a process that would have taken months and might have returned less than the cost of the effort. What happened instead was the thing that actually governed how a frontier valley operated, which was reputation and trust and the slow arithmetic of who was believed and who was not. Tamblyn said, before the meeting closed, that the Cattlemen's Association should adopt Marin Holloway's equipment standards for the coming drive season and commission her to assess the gear of any member operation that wanted an evaluation. He put it formally as a motion, which required a second, and Osley, who had been visibly calculating throughout the meeting and had apparently landed on the side where the math worked out, seconded it. Beckett did not vote against it. He abstained, which meant the motion passed, and which communicated everything it needed to communicate about what the room had decided. After the meeting ended and the men began to file out, Walt Greer stopped beside Marin's chair. He was not a man who made speeches, as had been established. He stood there with his hat in his hands and said, "I'm sorry for pulling out of the pooling agreement. I should have come to you directly before I made that decision." She looked at him. "You made the decision you thought protected your family," she said. "That's not something to apologize for." Then she added, with the slight directness that was simply how she spoke, "But next time, come to me directly." He nodded. He put his hat on. He left. Coulter was the last one in the room besides Marin. She was gathering the ledger and the folder, straightening the papers with the tidy efficiency of a person closing out a task. The fire at the far end of the room had burned down to low coals, and the afternoon light came through the window at an angle that made the dust motes in the air visible, drifting in the quiet. "Beckett won't stop being Beckett," she said, not looking up from the papers. "No," Coulter agreed. "He'll recalculate, find a different angle." "Probably." He picked up his hat from the table. "But he'll be doing it with a valley that just watched him sit at a table and not answer a direct question." She considered this. "That costs him something." "It costs him something," Coulter said. "Not everything, but something is where it starts." She closed the folder and looked up, and the afternoon light was on her face in a way that showed the tiredness in it. The accumulated weeks of it, the drive and the preparation, and the 3 years before that, and the 4 years before those that she didn't talk about but that were there, and the way she worked, and the care she took, and the notebook she kept because once she hadn't, and it had cost her everything she'd built. He wanted to say something that reached across what the moment contained, but the words that came to mind all felt like too much or not enough. And he had learned in his dealings with her that she responded better to accuracy than to eloquence. "You should know," he said, "that Tamblyn's motion wasn't his idea originally." She looked at him. "I spoke to him before the meeting," Coulter said. "I told him what I was going to present, and I asked him, if it landed the way I thought it would, to put the Standards Commission forward formally. Because if it came from me, it would look like I was protecting my own investment. Coming from Tamblyn, it's the Valley deciding." She was quiet for a moment. "That was well thought out." "You're not the only one who plans ahead," he said. She looked at him for another moment, and then she picked up her folder and her ledger and stood up from the chair, and she was just a woman with papers under her arm in a room with dying coals and winter light, and she said, "Walk me out?" They walked out together into the afternoon, into the cold air of Front Street, where Red Flint was conducting its ordinary business. The supply wagons, the men outside the feed exchange, the hotel with its door standing open, the sound of hammerwork from somewhere on the north end. None of it looked different. Nothing had been resolved so cleanly that the town had changed its face. Beckett would be in the hotel bar by evening, rebuilding his calculations. Pruitt would find a way to reframe what he'd said in the meeting into something he could live with. The three ranchers would go home and do their chores and decide privately whether the morning had changed anything. But Tamblin's motion had passed, and the ledger was a real document in a real folder under a real woman's arm, and the drive had come back with 312 animals and numbers on a tally sheet that didn't lie. Coulter walked beside her down Front Street in the cold afternoon, and he didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind that didn't need filling. The weeks after the cattlemen's meeting settled into Red Flint the way most significant things did in small towns. Not with a bang, but with a gradual rearrangement of the ordinary, like furniture shifted in a room you knew well enough that you noticed the difference without being able to immediately name it. Beckett did not disappear. Men like Harlow Beckett didn't disappear from valleys they had spent decades building influence in, and expecting otherwise would have been naive. He still came to the feed exchange in the mornings, still had his table at the hotel, still moved through the social geography of Red Flint with the practiced ease of a man who had survived harder seasons than one difficult meeting. But something had changed in how people positioned themselves around him, in the small calibrations of who approached him first and who waited to see how a room arranged itself before committing to a side. That kind of change was invisible if you weren't looking for it. Coulter was looking for it, and he saw it. Pruitt was the more significant shift. Dale Pruitt had built his reputation in this valley on the quality of his judgment, and having that judgment publicly complicated, not accused, not condemned, but complicated, was a cost he felt in the way that men who valued their own assessment of themselves felt costs most sharply. He came to Coulter 3 weeks after the meeting, arriving at the ranch on a weekday afternoon without sending word ahead, which was itself a departure from his usual manner. They talked for an hour in the front room, and what Pruitt said, stripped of the careful phrasing he used, was that he understood now that he had been used as a delivery mechanism for someone else's pressure campaign, and that he preferred to know when he was being used rather than finding out after the fact. Coulter said he appreciated that, and he meant it at about 70%, which was roughly the proportion of Pruitt's honesty he believed was genuine versus the proportion that was self-protection. 70% was enough. You didn't run a working operation in a frontier valley by requiring people to be better than they were. You ran it by understanding clearly what you were working with. What changed most visibly in Red Flint was the relationship between the town and the shop on Sutter Lane. It didn't transform overnight. It didn't transform the way things transformed in stories where a moment of public vindication causes immediate and complete reversal. What happened was smaller and more durable than that. It started with the cattleman's motion and Tamblin's visible endorsement, which gave the men who had been privately curious about Marin's work a socially acceptable reason to act on that curiosity. A rancher named Hollis came in asking about his saddle rigging. Then another, referred by Hollis. Walt Greer sent his son in with a set of pack harnesses for evaluation, and the boy stood in the shop doorway with the self-consciousness of youth and said his father had told him to ask Miss Holloway to check the collar geometry, which she did, explaining as she went so the boy understood what he was looking at rather than just getting the correction. The women of Red Flint were a different and more complicated matter. The ones who had been most pointed in their commentary about the seamstress from Sutter Lane did not suddenly arrive with warm bread and revised opinions. Some of them simply went quiet on the subject, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. A few redirected their energy toward other targets, because towns like Red Flint generated enough material for that. Margaret Foss, who did laundry on Depot Street and who had been among the first to warn Marin about the gossip, began referring customers openly, and her referrals carried weight because she was trusted in the practical network of women who moved resources around the town in ways that didn't always appear in the official record. Adelaide Beckett said nothing about Marin Holloway in public after the meeting. In private, Coulter was told by someone who had been present She said that the whole business was overblown and that her father had simply been trying to maintain standards, which was the version of events that a certain kind of person required in order to continue being that kind of person. And Coulter filed it away without much feeling about it. He had spent a long time in his life being bothered by what Adelaide Beckett thought of things, and he was finding that the supply of bothering had simply run out. He went to the shop on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, 6 weeks after the meeting. The lane looked different in spring, less abandoned somehow, or maybe he was seeing it differently now that he had spent enough time on it that it had stopped being the overlooked end of a forgotten street and had become a place he knew. The sign still hung on its one hook. She hadn't fixed that. He had considered fixing it himself and then decided that was overstepping something, though he couldn't have said precisely what. She was at the cutting table with what looked like canvas work, one of the commission pieces that had come in since the cattleman's motion, a set of panniers for a pack string operated by a rancher on the valley's west side. She looked up when he came in with the easy recognition of someone who had stopped being surprised by his presence and filed it under expected. "Tuesday," she said, which was how she noted that he came on Tuesdays more often than not, a pattern he hadn't deliberately created and now apparently owned. "Tuesday," he agreed. He sat down in the chair by the stove. She went back to the canvas. The shop was warmer than it had been in winter, the stove working less hard, the afternoon light coming through the front window at an angle that reached further into the room. She had added a second lamp at the cutting table, which he noticed because the light on her work was better than it used to be. "The Hollis Commission," he said, looking at the panniers. "His and 2 referrals from his. I have more work than I can complete at current pace." She said it without complaint, just as a statement of the situation. "I'm going to need to think about capacity." "What does that look like?" She was quiet for a moment, the way she was before she said something she'd been thinking through but hadn't said out loud. "It looks like more space and possibly another pair of hands, someone I could teach." She paused. "There's a girl who comes in for alterations sometimes. She's 17 and quick, and she's been watching how I work for 6 months. I think she could learn the basic construction in a season." "You'd want to pay her properly." "I wouldn't do it otherwise." She looked up. "The issue is space. This building is what it is. I can't expand here." He had been thinking about this since before the drive, which was a thing he had not said to her because the timing had not been right, and because he had wanted to be sure he was thinking about it for the right reasons, rather than for the reasons that would have made it complicated. He looked at the lamp she'd added, the organized shelves, the cutting table with its precise pattern pieces. He thought about the building she'd lost in Grantley and the 4 years she'd spent there, and what it meant to build something carefully and have it taken. "I own a property on Garner Street," he said, 2 buildings east of the hardware. It was the old Fenwick warehouse before I bought it with the land parcel 3 years ago. I've been using it for overflow storage, but that can go to the ranch." He paused. "It's bigger than this. Ground floor is one large open space, which could be divided. Separate entrance. It's on a proper street with traffic." She had stopped working. She was looking at him with the careful expression she used when she was reading something below the surface of what was being said. "I'm not offering it as charity," he said, because that was the thing she would need to know first. "I'd lease it at fair rate. Market rate for Garner Street, which you can verify independently with the county property office." "Why?" she asked. "Because the work you do is real and it needs a place that can hold what it's growing into." He met her eyes. "And because I've been watching you operate out of a building with a sign on one hook for 6 months, and I have a better building sitting empty." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said with the slight dryness that was one of the things he had come to recognize as particular to her, "That's a practical answer. It's a practical situation." "Is it only that?" The question landed in the quiet of the shop, and he sat with it for a moment before he answered, because she had asked him directly, and she deserved a direct answer rather than the version he would have given to someone who was asking carefully enough to be deflected. "No," he said, "it's not only that." She looked at him. She didn't fill the silence with anything, which was her way. She let things be what they were without rushing them toward a shape that was easier to manage. "I'm not an easy situation," she said finally. "I keep records of everything. I will disagree with you when I think you're wrong, and I won't always phrase it gently. I've built what I have from a starting point you know about, and I'm not interested in having it absorbed into something else. I know that, he said. I'm not asking you to be absorbed into anything. What are you asking? He thought about the first night in the shop, the cold and the torn coat, and a woman who had looked at him and seen a cold man who needed a repair rather than a fortune worth attaching herself to. He thought about the cattlemen's meeting and the canyon and the ledger and the long walk down Front Street in the winter afternoon when neither of them said anything and it had been enough. He thought about how rarely in his life he had sat in a room with another person and felt that the room was better for both of them, and how much of what he had been built alone, which was fine, which was what the circumstances required, but which had its own weight that you didn't notice until you started comparing it to something different. I'm asking if you want to build something here, he said, in this valley. That's yours and doesn't depend on my name to stand on its own. He paused. And I'm asking if you want to do that alongside me. Not inside my operation, alongside it. She was quiet for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. She looked at the panniers on the cutting table, and then at the shelves, and then at the front window, where the afternoon light was making a rectangle of warmth on the floor that slowly moved as the sun shifted. The lease would be at fair rate, she said. Fair market rate, he said. You can have a lawyer review it. I don't have money for a lawyer. Tamblyn uses a man in Creed who charges reasonable rates and does honest work. I can give you his name. The fee would be worth it. She looked at him again. You thought about this before you came in today. I've been thinking about it since before the drive, he said. I waited because the timing kept being wrong and because I wanted to be sure I understood what I was thinking about. And now you're sure. Sure enough, he said. I'm not a man who's sure about things. I'm a man who does the arithmetic until the numbers are good enough to act on. Something in her expression changed, not softened exactly, but settled, in the way of a person who has been carrying a vigilance for a long time and has found a situation where the vigilance can ease without disappearing. I'll look at the building, she said, and I'll think about the other part. That's all I asked, he said. She looked at the building on Thursday. He showed her through it without commentary, letting her move through the space at her own pace, which was slower than most people would have taken. She went into corners, checked the window light at different angles, stood in the center of the main floor, and turned around slowly the way you did when you were imagining a space differently than it currently existed. She looked at the ceiling joists and tested the floor near the east wall, which had some soft spots from water intrusion that had since been addressed but left their mark. The floor needs work on the east side, she said. I know. I'd have it done before the lease starts. I'd want to choose the flooring material. Fair enough. She stood in the middle of the big open floor for a moment, looking at the south windows. He could see what she was seeing, the light that would come through there in the afternoon, the space that could hold 2 work tables and a cutting area and a section for stock without feeling cramped, the separate entrance that meant her customers came through her door rather than his. It's a good building, she said. I know, he said. That's why I'm not using it for overflow storage. She looked at him with an expression that was almost humor. You stored grain in here. For 8 months. It deserved better. She walked to the window and looked out at Garner Street, which was busy in the late morning. Wagons, foot traffic, the ordinary commerce of a working frontier town. From here, the street looked different than it looked from Sutter Lane. Not better necessarily, just more present in the life of the place. There's something I want to say, she said, not turning from the window. About what you asked on Tuesday. He waited. I spent 4 years in Grantley building something that I thought was mine, she said. And it was, until it wasn't. And the reason it stopped being mine was that I had built it inside a structure that someone else controlled, and I hadn't understood that until it was too late. She turned around. What I have on Sutter Lane is small, and it's not enough anymore, but it's mine. Every scrap of it. I haven't taken money I didn't earn or relied on anyone's goodwill to keep the door open. I know that, he said. I need you to understand that I'm not looking for rescue, she said. I wasn't 3 years ago when I came to Red Flint, and I'm not now. I don't think you need rescuing, he said. I think you need a building with better floor space and more window light, and I happen to own one. He paused. And I think I'd rather not spend the next 20 years eating supper alone in a house that's too big for one person. But those are separate things, and neither of them requires the other. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The floor needs to be hardwood, something that holds up under industrial work." "I'll have it done before you move in," he said. "And the sign is mine. My name on the door." "Your name on the door," he agreed. She nodded once. Then she turned back to the window and looked at Garner Street with the expression of a person seeing a possible future in a specific place, which was different from seeing it abstractly and more real and more frightening and sometimes worth it anyway. The shop that opened on Garner Street in late spring bore a sign with clean, newly painted letters: Holloway Workshop, equipment, canvas, and leatherwork. The sign hung on 2 hooks, both of them solid. She had painted it herself. The girl she hired was named Dora, 17 and sharp-eyed, who showed up the first morning with her hair pinned back and her sleeves already rolled, and who turned out to learn faster than Marin had expected, and to have opinions about canvas weight that were occasionally wrong and occasionally right, and always worth hearing. By midsummer, Dora could complete a standard harness repair without supervision and had developed an opinion about breast collar geometry that differed slightly from Marin's own, and which Marin was still testing against evidence. Walt Greer's pooling agreement came back in the summer, along with Pollard and Voss, and the fall drive was structured from the beginning with 460 head and the northern route as the default plan rather than the contingency. Hodder signed on again, and Poole and the drive went without significant incident except for a lame horse in the 5th day that Coulter had caught early because Marin had shown him what to look for in the gate, and which was rested and recovered before it became a problem. Beckett's freight arrangement with Galton ended quietly. Coulter never knew exactly why, whether it was Beckett's calculation that the connection was now too visible to be useful, or whether the freight company had decided the association was more trouble than the account was worth. Either way, the supply discrepancies stopped, and the absence of them was its own kind of statement. Tamblin's commission came through properly in the fall, and Marin spent 3 weeks assessing the equipment of 4 association member operations, producing written evaluations that were direct enough to be useful and careful enough to be defensible, and which resulted in enough follow-on work that she had to tell Dora to handle the standard alterations and repairs on her own, while Marin focused on the consultation work. Dora did this without catastrophe, and with a self-possession that made Marin think she had underestimated the girl's readiness, which she noted in her ledger under a category she had labeled simply, "Things I got wrong." She kept that category. It had other entries. There were things that stayed hard. Coulter was not an easy man to be alongside. He was private in the way that men who had built things alone were private, comfortable with silence in a manner that sometimes felt like distance and sometimes felt like the most honest thing about him. And it was not always clear to her which it was. They disagreed about money twice in the first 6 months, once about the lease rate, and once about whether his name on an equipment proposal would help or hurt its reception with a rancher who didn't know her. On the second disagreement, she was wrong, which she acknowledged without pleasure, and he did not make it a point to reference after that, which she appreciated more than she said. She had nights in the rooms above the Garner Street shop when she lay awake and thought about Grantley, not with the particular pain of fresh loss, but with the older, duller weight of things that had happened and left their mark. She had built something once and lost it. She was building something again. The fear of the second loss was different from the fear had been before the first. It was more specific now, less abstract, because she knew exactly what it felt like when the floor went out. That knowledge didn't go away. It just sat alongside what she was doing and had to be accounted for, and most days she accounted for it and kept working. What she had understood in Grantley, and what Red Flint confirmed in a different way, was that the world had no particular interest in being fair. It was not designed to recognize competence or reward patience, or protect the careful work of people who built things quietly without connections. The people who had taken her shop in Grantley had not been exceptional villains. They had simply been people with more power exercising it in the directions that benefited them, which was what people with power usually did. And the only reliable protection against it was documentation and the kind of self-sufficiency that didn't depend on goodwill you didn't control. But Red Flint had also shown her something that Grantley hadn't, which was that power wasn't only held by the people who announced it most loudly. It was held by Russ Tamblyn putting his hands flat on a table and asking a direct question. It was held by Walt Greer standing up in a room and saying what he had been told. It was held in a ledger that had been kept since the third week of a contract because someone had learned the hard way that what wasn't written down could always be rewritten by someone with better lawyers. It was held in the particular quality of showing up and doing the work and being right about things in ways that couldn't be talked away. She was not the most respected figure in Red Flint. That was not how things actually worked. There were people who still crossed to the other side of Garner Street to avoid stopping to talk. And there were conversations that happened about her in places she wasn't, and the arc of a reputation, like everything else worth having, moved slowly and got interrupted and sometimes doubled back. What she had was something more modest and more real than the title of most respected anything. She had a shop with good window light and her name on the door and a girl named Dora who was learning to hear what a harness told you about a horse, and she had a valley that was slowly, grudgingly, coming to understand that the gear that went out on drives lasted longer and caused fewer injuries when it had been through the Holloway workshop first. On a Tuesday evening in late October, Coulter came by at the end of the working day. Dora had already left. The shop was cleaned and ordered, the tools in their places, the lamp at low. Marin was at the window with a cup of tea, looking at Garner Street in the last of the light. He came in without knocking, which he had started doing sometime in the summer, and which she had not told him to stop. He stood beside her at the window and looked out at the street. The evening traffic was thinning. Wagons heading out of town, the last of the foot trade making for home, the hardware 2 doors down pulling its shutters. Fall numbers came back, he said. Good? Better than last year. Better than I've had in 4 years. He paused. The per-head average was up 3%. Tamblyn says it's the condition improvement from the rigging work. It's partly that, she said. It's also the grazing route and the timing, and Hodder knowing the North Pass well enough to read the weather 3 days out. She looked at her tea. You shouldn't attribute one cause to what's actually several. I know, he said. I'm attributing it to the person who argued for all of them. She was quiet. Outside, the last wagon of the evening went by, the horses' hooves steady on the packed street. A lamp went on in the hotel across the way. Somewhere down the block, a door closed. The sign needs repainting before winter, she said. The cold will crack it if I don't seal it. I'll get the oil for you. I can get my own oil. I know you can, he said. I'll get it anyway. She looked at him, and he was watching the street with the particular stillness of a man who was exactly where he intended to be and had no plans to be anywhere else. And she thought, not for the first time, and not with any of the romantic certitude that the situation might have seemed to call for, but plainly, as a conclusion she had arrived at through evidence, that this was what it looked like when someone chose you. Not because you fit a role they needed filled. Not because you came with the right name, or the right family, or the right amount of easy social grace, but because they had watched you work and seen what you were made of, and decided, with whatever passed for certainty in their private accounting, that this was where they wanted to stand. It wasn't simple. It probably wouldn't get simple. But she had learned, in Red Flint and before it, that simple was not the same as worth having, and that the things built carefully on honest ground, even ground that had been disputed, even ground that had cost something to reach, were the ones that held when the weather came. She finished her tea. The last of the evening light left the window. Come on, she said. I'll lock up. And that was that. And it was enough. And they walked out into the autumn dark of Garner Street together, not into any particular future that had been settled or secured, but into the ordinary ongoing difficulty of building something that mattered, which was all anyone who was paying attention ever really got, and which, on the right evening with the right person beside you, turned out to be exactly sufficient.